Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is having a wonderful start to their week. Before we jump into all of the content, I just wanted to be sure that everyone knew who kind of brought us all into, who brought you into this beautiful mess this morning. So joined today organizationally are Front and Centered, People's Economy Lab, and the Statewide Poverty Action Network, kind of the community organizational partners. And our key state partner through this project has been the State Department of Social and Health Services. So really this team of Derek, Lori, Faduma, and me have really been working all of this together for the last several years and are excited to share what we've learned recently. So next slide, please. So I will kick us off with a little bit of background. I think many of you at this point are familiar with the Poverty Reduction Work Group. This was launched by the governor in 2018. And Poverty Action's role in this really has been both participation in the body of work, but also facilitating and convening the steering committee made up of people with low incomes from around the state, representing a variety of communities and experiences. In this body of work, it took a while. We came together with a steering committee of 25. We solidified around 18. There's a ton of work that went into this, but sort of with our role with the steering committee, I really wanted to highlight how much I think their impact and their input shows up in these 8 poverty reduction strategies. I think we probably would have seen some really good policy recommendations, but I think particularly strategy 2 around balancing power is really, I think a lot of what we heard from the steering committee, it's not new information from anything we've heard from other community groups before, but I think they really helped us crystallize this idea around balancing power. And it really sparked the journey that we are on now around what does it look like to do co-governance? What does it look like to really incorporate community leadership into the workings of the state? And that is a critical component of it, as well as undoing structural racism to achieving the policy goals and achieving the outcomes that we seek. So I'm excited to see how this the poverty reduction strategies move and live on in multiple different ways. I've heard lots of questions recently about what does the steering committee do now that the policy recommendations are complete. I'm thrilled to report that they continue to be an engaged, involved group. They're presenting at conferences all over the United States these days and are really excited about the prospect of continued advocacy to make sure that these policy recommendations can go into effect and have the impact in their communities that we'd like. So I will turn it over to Derek to talk about kind of the next phases in that.
Thanks, Marcy. Yeah, so another stream that can contribute to this river of action was a project that Front and Centered, People's Economy Lab, Poverty Action Network, and Washington Budget and Policy worked on that was supported by a Progress Alliance that really looked at the big picture intersectional understanding of what change in our state economy in Washington could look like if we all worked together. And through interviews and roundtable conversations, we developed a vision for an economy that's rooted in democracy and self-determination, which you're going to hear a lot about today, that's sustainable and equitable, and that creates shared economic well-being. And through this project, we identified some core principles that we must kind of adhere to moving forward to see that kind of change we want to see. Change that's in actions that's equitable, actions that are transformative, and actions that are regenerative. And we need to build out some core conditions for being able to move together in concert. And that includes understanding the history of our current economic system and defining and believing in our own future vision. And we did a lot of that in this project, making racism, sexism, classism, and other forms of expression explicit, working through conflict and building consensus on theory to win and to contend for power, to organize and engage the base and organize across silos throughout the state, to build trust, to exercise patience, and to build capacity for a long-term agenda, and to experiment, to try new things, to measure what's working and identify from potential failures as a pathway towards success. So these are kind of grounding conditions that we incorporated in part in this project that helped set the table for this through this prior work. The other quick lessons from this body of work that contributed were, there's a real tension in long-term positive vision for systems change and the immediate needs of people and communities that are suffering now. So we need to acknowledge those, and the need to be nimble and change and adapt quickly, and also bring together a large group of people. So there's opportunities to work on this, and we identified a set of strategies that are listed here. And shout out to the Climate Justice Alliance, which helped. We adopted some of their language, but of these strategies, the emphasis here is really on building the bigger we, and how do we build out, through one of the recommendations of this New Economy Washington report, a statewide process for engaging frontline communities to identify, our desired actions for change, and train and build the capacity of community leadership. So you're going to hear more about that today. And this was just a foundational piece we wanted to introduce that contributed to this project. And for a little bit more on the foundations, I want to pass it over to Lori now.
Thank you, Derek, and good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning. I'm going to give a brief timeline of events that have taken place as a result of the work that Derek was referring to with the New Economy Project, and also the 10-year plan, which has been a galvanizing document in a lot of ways. So the work that we're talking about today is really 3 years in the making, and even I would say beyond that, historically, the grounding for this goes way back in our history. But for the present, the 10-year plan was released in February of 2020, at least the first draft of it. We were just about to embark on a community tour to get feedback from communities across the state when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. And the motivation for the 10-year plan actually came from the 2008 recession, when we were balancing state budgets on the backs of people with low incomes, making things worse at a time when people really needed support the most. So when the pandemic hit and the economic consequences of the pandemic started to take hold, we saw an opportunity to really use the 10-year plan as this galvanizing document, and try to not repeat the mistakes that we made after the Great Recession. So a number of wonderful things happened in the wake of that. An Office of Equity was created at the state, the first one of its kind in the nation. I believe others now exist. The Environmental Justice Council was created. Both of those entities were created with support from our Health Disparities Council. We also launched an advisory group called Toward a Just and Equitable Future that really started to think about this question of what is missing. And those were the early partnerships that formed that created the Just Futures Coalition. We finalized the 10-year plan and submitted it to Governor Inslee in January of 2021. The HEAL Act in Washington State passed, which was just a monumental piece of legislation that same session. And both of those events allowed us to get support from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that really saw the intersection of the 10-year plan and the HEAL Act, the environmental justice and economic justice, and how they go together and how they impact health disparities. And so we were able to secure funding for them, which we passed through to front and centered and statewide poverty action, and the Just Futures Coalition was born. We have enjoyed that partnership now for several years. The governor also created a new sub-cabinet dedicated to these issues. We received funding in the previous state budget to fund the work, and we are actively trying to codify the work of Just Futures right now into our state governance. And since about last year, across all these different groups, there's really growing recognition that we share common goals and we have a unique contribution to make together. So here we are in 2023. It's exciting to have so many folks on the call from different states. We have not gotten to where we would like to be yet, but I think we've laid considerable strength in the foundation for this work moving forward. And I'll pass it to Faduma.
Thank you, Lori. While my video gets pinned, my name is Fatuma Fido. My pronouns are she, hers. I'm a lab leader with People's Economy Lab, which is an organization that works to advance the just transition to a restorative economy in Washington State. In addition to what my colleagues have shared, oh, can you go back, Tatiana? 1 second. And then Lori, if you don't mind pinning my video. So in addition to what you heard from my colleagues, we got here because of global pandemic, which forced us to really think differently about what our values are. In Washington State specifically, it revealed deep inequities within our system, specifically in the way our system is designed and implemented. Many live paycheck to paycheck, lack adequate medical facilities in their neighborhoods, rely on school food programs to feed their children, can't afford to miss work, and often need public transportation to keep running. Many in our communities were forced to choose between a paycheck and their health because they had to put food on the table. The recovery also disproportionately benefited wealthy white and metropolitan communities. I'll be sharing with you the results of the Just Futures project, produced in partnership with community-based organizations across the state representing Black, Indigenous, and people of color and low-income communities. Specifically, I will share with you a framework on how to work towards an equitable, regenerative, and transformative change in Washington State, as well as a community assembly guidance to create the conditions towards equitable policy design. In Just Futures, we sought to create space for leadership and participation of communities most impacted and historically excluded in decision-making, specifically in setting the vision, measures, and holding the state accountable. And so we were seeking to create opportunities for government agencies to collaborate with community-owned enterprises to direct targeted investments where people most impacted are central to decision-making. To this goal, we work to educate and strengthen statewide community capacity in economic literacy and power building, and to define, measure, and build accountability towards a just transition via the economic recovery of COVID-19 in Washington State. To do so, we wanted to establish community cornerstones for a just and equitable future. The core principle of the Just Futures project is to create an equitable, regenerative, and transformative change. That the purpose of the economy is rooted in the idea that what's in the soil, our natural and human resources, bears the fruit, health, and opportunity to ensure people and environment thrive and that ecological balance is maintained. We also believe an effective visioning of a new way of managing and distributing our shared resources requires understanding the history of our current economic system in order to redefine and shape it. That in order to realize just and equitable outcomes, we must first create the conditions necessary to pursue them. We must build consensus with communities most impacted and harness power through sustained, statewide, cross-silo efforts on trust building, community research, and to establish long-term systemic change. This objective aligns with the 10-year economic plan from the State Poverty Reduction Work Group, specifically Strategy 2, which is to balance power and make equal space in decision-making for people and communities most affected by poverty and inequality. Early in our process, we formed a community leadership committee to collaborate with leaders across the state. To ground our understanding of the economy, we look to Movement Generation's Just Transition framework. Our current economy is built on exploitation of resources and human labor for the purpose of accumulating wealth and power for the few. Systems built upon ideologies such as white supremacy, patriarchy, consumerism, and militarism are used to maintain governance. Our collective community vision is to transition to an economy that's rooted on a defined shared purpose and embedded in social and ecological well-being, and better governance rooted in deep participatory governance. In our conversations with the committee, it became evident that many experience and interact with the economy through lived experiences tied to identity, such as racial, ethnic backgrounds, including income levels. It's assumed that services are accessible to everyone simply because they exist. Our cultural workers are not provided the opportunity to know or realize the real returns of their work. Simply put, when communities do not experience any value or dignity in their work, when they do not have power in changing the conditions under which they work, they do not have power in their communities. Many of their decisions are defined by where we work and live. This slide specifically represents an accumulation of what we heard from the Committee Leadership Committee. We heard that state has responsibility and accountability to provide for basic needs, especially in less feasible communities, and overall maintain an inclusionary economy for communities formerly incarcerated and those living in rural areas. That community-based organizations have the unique ability to understand needs and assets government cannot match. We need to shift resources and taxes and leverage in large institutions and investing in community organizations and businesses, where government work is an expression of community passion and people most impacted are central to decision-making, where care work and all work is valued and compensated, work that's restorative, relational, and communal. The idea of a just transition framework is to look at a broader vision of well-being and governance as core elements of the economy, a living economy that prioritizes the well-being of people instead of exploiting their labor. A transition is about giving power back to the people to create sustainable future tied to the relationship with and relies on equitable systems, and that state measures of success and progress focus on concentration and accumulation of money for those with power rather than core condition and outcomes needed for the well-being of everyone. Our communities want to shift focus to living qualitative and quantitative indicators of human and ecological well-being, disaggregated by race and geography to compare actions against, to look to communities most harmed by the current economy to define what well-being means to them. In addition and beyond, access to basic needs such as healthcare, jobs, food, and education. The tree in the middle represents collective work and collective visioning, where community is best positioned to establish public objectives rooted in community-defined needs that government is best positioned to support and resource. The 4 quadrants represent the cornerstones of co-governance for a just and equitable future. The gray arrows represent zones of engagement between some of those quadrants. Specifically in establishing commitment, action items proposed by the committee are that government should dedicate a percentage of agency budgets to participatory budgeting processes and direct funding for community capacity building, that they should require agencies to incorporate racial equity analysis and community input in policy, budget, and strategic plan decisions, and more so to provide double feedback loops and retouch base with community in order to understand whether implementation meets desired intent. They also want community to be able to build capacity. The committee proposed that government should fund and support statewide network of community assemblies led by community-based organizations to provide leadership, direction, and oversight in the co-creation of solutions, to build alliances among community-based organizations to create a coalition that coordinates shared funding and strategic planning across agencies and community assemblies. For equitable practices, the committee proposed that we develop in partnership with community and frontline communities and government to engage in opportunities and co-create within state agency action, to fund community member participation in state engagement processes via community-based organizations, and to develop a community equity and accountability framework to apply to agency practices and activities such as rules, budgeting, and contracting processes, and ultimately to shift and to move towards shared governing power. The committee proposed that we should create a cross-agency governance body composed of community members and leaders, similar to the work being done through the Communities of Opportunities at King County, the Environmental Justice Council, Poverty Reduction Work Group, Health Disparities Council, and so forth, to advance co-governance practices, and to create agency guidelines and toolkits on how to decentralize power within leadership structures. When we say shared governing power, we wanted to emphasize that the cornerstones is a shift towards drawing information, decision-making, and control back to communities most impacted in order to build power and self-determination. A report produced by the Partners for Dignity and Rights and Race Forward defined collaborative governance as a collection of participatory models and practices in which government and communities work together through formal and informal structures to make collective policy decisions, to create programs to meet community needs, and to ensure those policies and programs are implemented effectively. We saw in the report aspects and elements from our conversations with community leaders illustrated in the cornerstones. The report analyzed 3 case studies where communities came together to mobilize towards systems change in their schools, neighborhoods, and workplace. It emphasized on the need to cultivate community capacity, build relationships, pursue inside and outside strategies, make co-governance enforceable, and overall transform the culture of governance. So how do we get there? We found one tool to operationalize the cornerstones and co-governance framework is to utilize community assemblies. Community assemblies enable people of color, PIPA communities and low-income communities to mobilize and convene frontline communities, to identify lived experience and economic struggles, to create and assess solutions, to recommend solutions to government agencies, and overall build consensus towards collective action. The committee defined assemblies as a participatory democratic platform that brings people together with a clear purpose and strategy to articulate community needs, assess solutions, and mobilize for action. It's just one tool to operationalize the cornerstones of co-governance. Other models are participatory budgeting. Community assemblies are used locally, nationally, and globally to mobilize and empower communities, and we research them to understand how they can be used in Washington state. Each community assembly will be organized and facilitated by an assembly anchor, an existing community-based organization, and/or a grassroots group with pre-existing deep relationships in frontline communities, and that frontline communities buy in. They must meet specifically 3 criteria. They must have experience in community organizing, community capacity building, and legislative advocacy. Community assemblies can be organized by a single organization or a partnership of organizations, and they must fulfill the following roles and responsibilities. They must have a leadership structure. They must be able to understand and be able to put together a strong facilitation. and they must be able to meet data collection and reporting guidelines. They must be able to name and discuss the different pathways to community members' shared vision, be able to plan how to achieve and coordinate the joint action, and once decided, pass on to the assembly anchor to ensure implementation. The long-term purpose of community assemblies is to be able to establish community-identified policy and programmatic solutions to address community-identified issues and challenges and assess progress on well-being. The short-term goal of each community assembly is to be able to resolve among community members to work together specific goals, create proposals for action, commit to taking action as a community, and provide input or corrective feedback to the work underway. They must be able to have efficient and overarching outreach to engage BIPOC, low-income, and overly burdened communities. It must be equipped with a well-designed, structured, high-level discussion of community issues and co-creation of action steps to establish definitions and context on the onset. And they must be able to create or adopt a consent-based consensus practice. These assemblies are expected to bring together people with a variety of life experiences that have been historically marginalized. Assembly spaces are intentionally convened and inclusive of people and ideas. These assembly spaces must shift our understanding of power and leadership. An assembly can consist of one or more convenings with the same group of participants, reflect the local leadership, culture, and practices of the participants and organizers, strengthen community institutions and leadership at the grassroots level. We urge government institutions to rethink the role of community in policy design, decision-making, and implementation. Communities need government to play an active role in resourcing community assembly capacity building and technical assistance. We need them to provide access to data and information needed for community members to engage in policy design. We want government to listen to what community members have to say without judgment. And ultimately, we want them to support assembly anchors and community members to enact these resolutions post-community assembly.